Just checks her eyes. Loosen up the mark. Very good crowd.
You want to walk around?
We're talking about Israel. But then spend the first half hour talking at Irvine wine on Sunday. Big deal. More people.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming in the library today on this nice hot day to see Mr. Dwoskin. I just wanted to say that on Friday we will be playing a movie called 80 for Brady here at the library at 2 p.m. It's about 4 friends and their mission was to meet Tom Brady. It has Jane Fonda in there. I think it's like 2 hours, the movie. Anyways, thank you for coming in, and Mr. Dwoskin, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Angela. My God, she's so glamorous. Man, she turns a basement into a star palace here. Anyway, I just have to tell you about this morning. I did this wonderful tour of the Mount Royal Cemetery, and it was led by professional tour guides, Frances Stober. I don't know if any of you have ever done any of her tours around Montreal. She does a lot of them. And it was really interesting because we went to, first of all, she told us about the history of the cemetery and how it was owned by some of the biggest English families in Montreal, the McCulloughs, the Tates, and who else I can't remember. And they gave the land in the mid 1800s to build a cemetery for the English community there. And they offered land to the Jewish community to have their cemetery within their own cemetery, but they refused, and they bought land from the same landowner just on the outside of that cemetery. But interestingly enough, the Temple Emmanuel, they have their cemetery inside the cemetery of the Protestant cemetery. And so we walked over there to have a look-see, and probably the most beautiful grave that we saw there was Sir Mortimer B. Davis. Remember, the founder of the Imperial Tobacco Company, which is still ongoing today. They own Players and Rothmans, I think, and a whole bunch of other cigarette brands. But in his day, he was one of the biggest philanthropists around. And so he has a beautiful tomb there, and his family does also. And who else did we see there? Anyway, but then, when we walked out of there, we spent most of the time in the very, very large English cemetery. And the Molson family cenotaph is the most unbelievable structure. If you haven't seen it, it's worth seeing. It's an enormous tower, pillar or tower going way, way up in the air, and this huge mausoleum built all around it by a very famous architect. And that area is still being used today by the Molson family. And there were a lot of other interesting graves. The grave of Sir Hugh Allen, the founder of the CPR Railway, is there also, and with his whole family. So, you're looking at history when you go see something like that. And it's, of course, a beautiful, quiet, bird-filled, tree-filled area to walk around. So, you can drive your car up there and just go out and walk around. So it was really it was really interesting. She also told us one story of one of the most important people in the Hudson's Bay Company, who was known as a real shrewd, hard bargainer. And when he passed away, they took his bones they preserved them in rum, put them in a box, and they sort of went from one place to another of the Hudson's Bay forts, and people who either hated him or loved him, they either came and turned their backs on him, or they, took off their hats. They shipped his whole casket to England, and from England it came back to Montreal, where he wanted to be buried, and he's buried up there in the same place as everyone else. So anyway, an interesting morning, and if you happen to catch a tour like that, it's really quite well worthwhile to look at. Newses of the week, we've got plenty of them, and I think you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with the Alberta election, which just happened yesterday, and it teaches us a lesson that we have already learned quite a bit, which is that polls don't always tell the story, and if polls are going to go wrong, if they're going to make a mistake, they're going to make a mistake in favor of the left-wing or liberal candidate, and not of the right-wing or conservative candidate. So in the last polls were showing that this election in Alberta was quite close. Many people were predicting that the NDP would win the election, and sure enough, they lost by a pretty big margin, 49 to 38 in seats. I think that was the number. So it's a pretty big loss. Now, the NDP before had 20 seats, so they went up to 38, so they almost doubled their seats. The Conservatives had 60, and they went down to 49, so they lost. So the polls were showing the right direction, but they weren't showing the right result. And it goes to show that there is, a so-called silent majority of people who are conservative, who don't talk to pollsters, or who aren't polled by pollsters, and who turn out to vote, and often will vote for the more conservative choice. And we've seen that certainly in the last Turkish election, which we talk about, where they just had the finals last weekend. And the original polls in that election were showing that the center left candidate was going to win. And sure enough, he lost. It took 2 rounds to defeat him, but he still ended up losing 52 to 48, which is close. I mean, I'm not saying 52 to 48 is kind of a runaway, but pollsters who are paid to be scientific analysts of public opinion get it wrong lots of times, and here is another time when they did get it wrong. So there are 2 out of 2. What's interesting about the Alberta and the Alberta election is that the way things have worked out in Alberta, which is Canada's most conservative province, and also mostly to the same degree in British Columbia, is that there is no center party. There is no party in the middle of the political spectrum. The parties have split out into right and left, and there's nothing in the middle. And in Canada, we're used to having parties in the middle. We're used to having a liberal party, which is a little bit center-left, a conservative party, which is a little bit center-right, and those are the 2 main parties who've competed for office in Canada since the beginning of time. We've had, in Quebec, regional parties. The NDP, which is a left party, has had staying power. But by and large, the split between the way we see it in the U.S. between a very right-wing conservative party and a kind of center-left Democratic party is foreign to Canadian politics until recent times. And in recent times, in Alberta, what we have seen is this right-wing party. I wouldn't even call them center-right, but a right-wing party has now won office for the 2nd time in a row. And some of the policies that they are promoting are policies which to the rest of Canada might seem a little bit radical. For example, give you some examples. They would very much like to get rid of this whole environmentalist stream of politics, or the green stream of politics. Because Alberta is such a big oil and gas producer, and these resources have added to their economy tremendously. Alberta is a province which is running a surplus, meaning they collect more money than they spend. The reasons for all of that, of course, is the oil and gas business. And prices of oil and gas have been high in the last year. And so the government collects royalties from the producers and pipelines, and that's what they put in the piggy bank. So obviously any kind of promotion to get away from oil and gas, to say, well, oil and gas belong to yesterday, and solar power and wind power belong to today. Clearly, it's not in Alberta's interests, and the new premier, or the Daniel Smith, who's the premier, is not afraid to say so. And by the way, here was an election between two women, which is also pretty unusual to have. The only two major candidates being women facing off against each other. I think we had that in Ontario. I'm trying to remember now. Yeah. We had it in Ontario about 10 years ago. The other idea that she's had is to say that if the federal government tries to pass a law which goes against Alberta's interests, Alberta should ignore that law. Now, clearly, this is a kind of a constitutional challenge, we'll say. But she's not afraid to stand up to Ottawa and to say, you've been milking us dry for all these years. Alberta contributes more to Canada than gets back from Canada. And it's time that Alberta put a stop to it. Mm-hmm. So this is a kind of a nationalism, I would say borrowed from Quebec in a certain way, because Quebec was the first province really in Canada to express this type of nationalism. The other idea that she has is to create a police force of their own. So, for example, we have the SQ in Quebec, the provincial police. And Alberta says, well, why, we should do the same thing. We'll have our own police force, which is going to operate only for Albertans, by Albertans, and not have people transfer in and transfer out, and not have the headquarters of our police force located not in our province. So you could see that this is a continuation of this sort of stream of nationalism, which she promotes. And there were and are in Alberta secessionist parties who would like to take Alberta out of Canada altogether, and who say that Alberta would be much better off on their own. Now, some of these parties ran candidates in this election, but of course they got nowhere. Just to remind you that the party in power in Alberta is called the United Conservative Party, the UCP. So what does United mean? It means it's a union of two former conservative parties, the Conservative Party and the Wild Rose Party. And the Wild Rose Party, Wild Rose is like the state flower, the provincial flower of Alberta. That party grew up in frustration with the moderate positions that the Conservative Party had. So when they ran separately 2 elections ago, they split the right-wing vote, and the NDP won the election under Rachel Notley. Then they learned their lesson, saying that, united we stand, divided we fall. And so they united, and in the last election, they won this huge majority, as I said before, 60 to 29. Yeah, 60 to 29. And they stayed united in this in this election, and they came out ahead, as I said, in a much closer election, but still. Now, Alberta is like the rest of Canada, but always with exaggeration. You know what I mean? Like whatever the rest of Canada is, the Albertas are Canadians, but everything is taken to an extreme. So if you look at the results of the election, Alberta usually divides itself into three parts: the city of Edmonton, the city of Calgary, and the rest of Alberta. The city of Edmonton, every single riding in the city went for the NDP, every single one. That's why Edmonton's nickname is called Redmonton. Calgary is usually more conservative, but has some NDP in it. This time, they really the NDP did win over many seats in Calgary that they didn't have, but still, it's sort of, in other words, Calgary is still a mix. Remember that Calgary is the heart of the oil business in Canada and in Alberta, and it's the business capital of Alberta. And Edmonton is like the government capital, the research capital, the public services capital, healthcare, universities, things like that. So naturally, they're going to be less conservative than Calgary. But the rest of Alberta, pretty well, always votes 100% conservative. Whether you're in the north of the province where the oil sands are, or whether you're in the south of the province where the ranches are, it's solid blue, as it was this time. So it's like three different worlds all wrapped up in one province. And of course, every state and every province is similar in that way, right? The cities are the ones which are more liberal. But the sort of degree to which the difference shows is much stronger in Alberta than in other places. So for example, in rural BC, there's lots of places that vote NDP. In rural Ontario, there's lots of places that vote NDP. In rural Manitoba, there's places that vote NDP also, but not in Alberta. So Danielle Smith is the leader, even though they've been saying this. If you go back in history and you pull out quotes of some of the crazy things that she said, she tends to be more Trump-like than I don't know what John Diefenbaker like, or Crosby like, or a moderate moderate conservative. Remember, Alberta also is a province which was influenced by immigration from the United States around the early 1900s, late 1800s, when Mormons were moving out of Western US to try to expand their colonies, and a lot of them ended up in Alberta, and Mormons traditionally vote conservatively. So, that American rootstock of Albertans does explain some of the reasons why they're so conservative. But mostly it's because of oil and the business and the taxation and the resentment that they pay taxes to Ottawa, but Ottawa, doesn't invest back into Alberta. In fact, Ottawa is trying to weaken Alberta. Alberta is the only province in Canada that doesn't have a sales tax. You know that? They just have the GST, which of course they didn't want. And there's no sales tax because the government's got enough money as it is. So, that province and the BC in general have been growing faster than the rest of Canada. So when seats are reallocated in the House of Commons every 10 years, Alberta and BC are gaining seats, and Eastern Canada, including Quebec, stay the same. So in other words, the relative weight of the West is growing in Canada and will continue to grow. So that's the Alberta election in a nutshell. Rachel Notley did very well, so she's not resigning. It's interesting to see also, if you look at the list of candidates, how many there are of Asian background, meaning India, Chinese, and also how many there are of indigenous background. So there were several of those groups running for office there, reflecting the population, of course, of the province. Any before I move on, any questions about that? So let's talk. Let's do a follow up about the Turkish election, because I spoke about it 2 weeks ago, and the results were as predicted. And all kinds of people are now making predictions of what the future will hold. Is this good for the US? Is it good for Russia? Is it good for Israel? Is it good for the Turkish people themselves? Is it good for the Turkish economy themselves? And the amount of frustration that the liberal side of Turkey has is enormous. Remember, they got to 48% of the total vote, which is, almost half. And I was listening to a broadcast on PBS, and they said that Mr. Erdogan had 32 hours of public service broadcasts on the government-run TV station, 32 hours of ads, and they only allowed the opposition 32 minutes of ads. So yes, in a sense, you could say it's a fair election in that the votes were counted, properly, but, it all started with a stacked deck. And not just the TV stations, but radio stations, newspapers, the whole public media are in the hands, not necessarily of the Turkish government itself, but in the hands of friends and relatives of Mr. Erdogan, who own the networks and who own the telephone systems and things like, you know what I mean? The whole telecommunications sector are in the hands of his allies. And so that leaves no room for an opponent to buy ads or to make a statement or anything like that. Now, Mr. Putin was one of the first people who congratulated Mr. Erdogan, because in a certain sense they see very eye to eye on their methods. They both are sort of strongmen, nationalists. They share two sides of the Black Sea. And at most, what Putin would like is that Erdogan should be neutral in the war with the Ukraine. And Erdogan is neutral in the war to the Ukraine, because so much Russian money is piling into that country. So much trade that goes to Russia and from Russia passes through Turkey to sanitize the trade. Turkey is making out very well because of this war between its two neighbors to the north. The other issue that came up very strongly in this election campaign was the issue of refugees. And refugees are a subject that is way broader than Turkey is. Refugees are an issue which somehow or other, if you go back in our own minds, right, we're children of the 50s and 60s, let's call us, something around there. By the time the dust settled after the Second World War and after the occupation of Eastern Europe by the Soviet Union, after all that took place, in other words, by around 1948, things kind of for 40 years more or less stayed quiet. So there weren't any huge waves of refugees. There was a small one from Hungary in '56. I remember them coming here to Montreal. But there weren't any huge waves of refugees until the world order started to fall down or break down at the beginning of the 1990s, when the Soviet Union fell apart, when Yugoslavia fell apart, and civil wars started breaking out in the Middle East and Iraq, and the Iranian Revolution in 1979. All of these disturbances started 40 years roughly after the Second World War ended. So we weren't accultured to the idea that refugees are normal, that refugees are something that the world is going to have all the time, and that whether there's a way to deal with refugees as a whole group everywhere, or whether each little case has to be dealt with on its own, that problem has not yet been resolved. But in Turkey, both political parties who are running both said, we want to repatriate or kick out the refugees that came to live in Turkey. 4.5 million of them, I think it was. Let me see now. Yeah, I think that's right. 3.5 million or 4.5 million. I wrote it down somewhere. I wrote it down. Let's see if I found it here. Okay, yeah. Yeah, I think it's 3.5. Because Lebanon has 3.5 million. No, Lebanon has 1.5 million, and Syria has 3.5 million. So that's like 5 million refugees leaving Syria to come to those two countries alone. And they do pose a burden on the countries, and especially a country like Lebanon and Turkey, which are experiencing enormous amounts of inflation. It's so easy to blame outsiders for any problems that the country has, and both sides both sides decided to do that. If I were a Syrian refugee in Lebanon or a Syrian refugee in Turkey, I would sort of start, packing my suitcase and thinking, what are my other choices? Because, somehow or other, they've worn out their welcome in both countries. Lebanon is a holy mess. Their currency is devalued by 99% since 1970. But this brings up another question, and actually, one of the themes that I would like to speak about today, I just brought it up to you, and this has to do with Mr. Assad of Syria rejoining the Arab League, which you might have seen pictures of. You might have seen the TV screen. He looks the same. This guy doesn't age. I don't know who's his hairdresser or who's his beautician, but this guy, you look at him now and you look at him in 2011, looks exactly the same. And the war in Syria broke out in 2011, the civil war. It is now 2023, so it's 12 years later. The civil war broke out because his family had been in power since 1970 in Syria. And they ruled the country with an iron fist. They did not allow free elections. They arrested and harassed reporters, newspaper people. They arrested anybody they wanted. They took for themselves the best of the economy that they could funnel into their brother-in-law's holdings. And the country was just bumbling along without any kind of real aim or purpose. That's on the surface part. The underneath part was, of course, that Syria is made up of a whole bunch of different ethnic groups and religions. And the Assad family belonged to an ethnic group or religion that is only 15% of the population. The other 85% are not from his gang. And he had all the power, and he used it. His father was even more ruthless than he is. It's funny. He I think, graduated as an ophthalmologist. And people were thinking, well, when he gets into power, at least, he'll be moderate because he went to school in England and, he's a studious boy. His brother, who was supposed to take over after his father, died in a car crash. So, people were hoping good things from him, but of course they didn't happen once he got his feet wet and, once he got drunk with power. He played one side against another in the country. He told the Christians, if you don't side with me, the ISIS will take care of you and you'll all be, killed. He told his own group, the Alevis, the Alawites, the same thing. He told the Sunni, who are the majority in the population, that if they stray into radical Islam, that they will be punished. So he sort of set one side against another, and he tried to hold on to power that way until demonstrations happened in the country against him. And as often happens when a leader is challenged, he says, I have two choices. I have two choices when people are demonstrating in the streets. Either I let them go and make a speech to say, well, you know, I've heard what people have to say and I'll try better, or I disagree with them, but I respect their right to demonstrate. So that's a choice. That's a choice that would happen here. A choice that would happen in China or in Russia or in Cuba or in Venezuela or in Nicaragua or in Iran or in Syria is you get the secret police to round them up, beat them up, kill a few of them, send the rest to jail, and threaten their relatives, which is what he did. So that's the dictator's choice, use force. Because, you know, the old saying, if you give them an inch, they'll take a mile, that's exactly what these people are afraid of. And so by responding overly harshly to those demonstrators, what he did is create more demonstrators. Because now people were complaining about how their relatives were being tossed in jail and being beaten up. And so that's how the revolution began in Syria. It also began because at the same time, in 2011, there was the so-called Arab Spring, where demonstrators in Tunisia, of all places, started to demonstrate against the rulership, against the dictatorship, and they succeeded in overthrowing the dictatorship. In the same way in Libya it started, and they got rid of Gaddafi. It started in Egypt, and they got rid of Mubarak. And it passed over into Syria as well. Except in Syria, he dug in his heels and said, I'm not leaving no matter what. And he was able to beat back the opposition by bombing their districts in Damascus, by using chemical weapons against them, by just going all out in a kind of a real hard civil war against his opponents. He also used the idea that ISIS was around at the time, if you remember the Islamic State, which controlled part of Syria. And what he said was, I am fighting for the West against ISIS, which is true, but beside the point. Is that me? No. Okay. As long as it's not me. So fortunately for Assad, ISIS was in their strong period in the 2010s when all of this was going on, and he said, look, if the West doesn't back me, ISIS will take over the country, and will be another Iran. So in some ways he was right in a certain way, but it just meant that it was muddying the waters as to how the Civil War would end up. And in the end, he won the Civil War. He has control over the whole country, except for the northeastern part of the country where a kind of semi-autonomous Kurdish state has been established, and one small province in the far northwest where the rebels and the refugees are living. So here's the question that I want you to think about. When you have a dictator like this who's managed to stay in power, and you've tried boycotts, and you've tried isolation, and you've tried seizing maybe their assets abroad, and you've tried turning the media against them, and you try all these things for years, and nothing works. So should the West continue with this policy or not? We have lots of examples of this. What are some of your favorites? The two most favorite examples of boycotts, what are they? Okay, 3. We'll call them 3. All right. We'll throw Iran as number 3. But before Iran. Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one. That's one that succeeded. That's one that did succeed to change the administration. That did. That's the exception to the rule. There's always an exception to the rule. That's the exception to the rule. I won't say that the boycott was the reason for the changeover in regimes, but it certainly added to it. I'm thinking of 2 very famous cases. One is Cuba, which the United States has been embargoing since 1960 to get rid of the communist government. And they figured, well, if we shut Cuba off for a year, that's it. People will just rebel and they'll kick out the communists. It's now 2023. So that's 63 years later. The Communist Party is still running Cuba. What boycott started in 1948? That's right, Israel. The whole Arab world boycotted Israel since 1948, saying that maybe they'll crumble to dust if they're surrounded and no one is allowed to trade with them. And if we try secondary boycotts, meaning anybody, we make it a choice to traders, it's either them or us. If you trade with them, you can't trade with us, even if in other words, even if a company is trading with another company and that company is trading with Israel, we go back to find out who the original companies are, that type of thing. Did anything happen to Israel since 1948? No. It's as strong as ever, if not stronger up until now. So boycotts, in other words, the point is, if they don't work, isn't there a time to say, okay, let's try something else? Now, that's the point with Assad. The Iranian regime, they've been in since 1979. The United States boycotted them pretty well since 1979. You remember they seized the U.S. Ambassador, and that's it. The U.S. said, okay, no, we're freezing you out. So what happened? Nothing, right? They're still around. The U.S. started one with Russia after they invaded the Ukraine. It's still early, but Russia, I was just reading the statistics for oil exports of 2022. Russia had a record year of exports. They never exported more oil ever in their history since last year was the highest one. So what did the boycott do? Basically nothing. So no, but I'm just saying, what I'm saying is that if you think of boycotts as supposedly an effective tool, whether you're talk about Venezuela, the same thing when Hugo Chavez got in, the U.S. decided to freeze their oil exports, to not send any oil maintenance materials into the country, to basically treat them like pariahs, to kick them out of the South American Bank, all kinds of steps that they wanted to take because Chavez and Maduro, his follower, were communists, and the U.S. doesn't like communists. P.S. They're still in power, and now the U.S. is walking back toward them kind of on hands and knees almost. So the question is, if you break the boycott and if you say, okay, we changed our mind, we're like the Arab world did, they said, now to Syria, we're letting you back into the Arab League. So what that means is, the lesson you're giving these leaders is you could do anything you want. If you get away with it and you're strong enough, no one's going to come back against you. So it goes against the sort of idea of crime and punishment. You're rewarding bad behavior. On the other hand, if you don't do that, if you continue to boycott these countries, well, these countries will always look at their bad economic situation, because certainly the economic situation in most boycotted countries is bad. That's why, by the way, South Africa folded so quickly, because They were really concerned with their standard of living of the white population. But in other places where the standard of living has gone down, like in Syria, like in Lebanon, like in Iran, for example, in Russia, they've had a minus year starting this year, so we'll see where it goes, but so far they're in the minuses. Other countries as well. But take Cuba, for example. You know, it's probably, except for Haiti, the poorest country in the whole Western Hemisphere. And if you ask the leadership, well, how are you responsible for this country? How come you're supposed to be the Communist Party ruling on behalf of everybody? Why aren't people better off? The answer is very simple: the American boycott. It's not us, it's the Americans. They're not trading with us. They're telling people not to trade with us. They're not allowing tourists to come to our country. So naturally, what do you expect? Do you expect us to get down on our hands and knees and to kiss their feet? No, we're going to resist. And that's the normal feeling that the countries have when you challenge them, when you threaten them, is to resist. And it makes their bad leaders stronger, because now their bad leaders have a real enemy that they can point to. As they said in Iran, the great Satan, stepping on American flags and stepping on Israeli flags, is something that by and large the people support when they see that Iran is being threatened by those countries. So that's one point. The second point is that yes, the leadership are put in a position in a way to say, it's not our fault. But the lives of the actual people in those countries are made worse. And those people, the average citizens, are not responsible for what their governments are doing, because it's not a democracy. So let me give you the latest example that's being talked about now around the world, is Afghanistan. You know, when the Allies left Afghanistan, the Taliban took over. They reimposed all their hard rules of Islam in the country. The country was already the poorest country in Asia, and things only got worse, among other reasons, because the Afghan government had $800 million in foreign exchanges in foreign banks, and the world prevailed on these banks not to release the money, because what they said was the Taliban aren't legitimate rulers in the country, and therefore we don't want to give them the money. And then, of course, after that, they had all kinds of secondary boycotts. Although Afghan doesn't produce much, but still they tried to freeze up their whole economy. So the net result is that 80% of Afghans are miserably poor. I mean, really poor. And the NGOs, the United Nations, and all the aid organizations, they don't want to help the country because they say we disagree with what the leaders are doing. They say, well, when you open up schools to women, then we'll give you the money. When you allow women to go for jobs and run for parliament, we'll give you the money. And so the Afghan government says, just no thanks. And that's the end of it. Everybody thought, no, for sure they're going to liberalize their country, because after all, the well-being of their citizens are at stake. But you don't understand the psychology of these leaders. Their leaders don't care about the well-being of their citizens. They care about their own power and the principles that they run on, that they live by. So it's like saying, I don't know, this is going to be a stupid example, but it's like saying, I don't know what, let's say, when Mr. Rahman, you remember when he had the big real estate company and all that, and he was in a bit of trouble. And if they would say, Mr. Rahman, we'll help you out, but you have to eat unkosher and break Shabbat. What do you think he's going to say? Oh yeah, sure, it'll pay me in the long run. He'll say, no, of course not. I live by principles and I'm not going to change them, even if you wave sort of dollar bills in front of my nose. That's what normal people do. That's what normal psychology is. So now the question becomes, so what does the West do? For example, the Arab world. Why did they let Assad back into the Arab League? What was their thinking? What was their motivation for doing it? First of all, who knows what is Syria's largest export? What? Somebody said oil? That's not right. I'm so sorry, I can't hear you. Produce. No, they don't have much produce, but you know what? If you want to buy something made in Syria, here in Montreal, you go to the stores like Akavan, those Middle Eastern stores, they have this beautiful pressed apricot paste. It's like apricot, like a sheet of apricot. It's got a little bit of oil, mixed in with it. And you sort of tear it off like sort of, rubber fruit, like that kind of thing. It's really good. And they still seem to be making that, but that's about it. Anyway, the answer is drugs. The answer is drugs. They are the largest producer of something called captagon, which is an amphetamine. And that's pretty well the only thing that they do. And of course, they export it to Saudi Arabia, to United Arab Emirates, to the whole Middle East, where anybody, can buy these made in Syria drugs. And, Mr. Assad is really in the drug business. That's pretty well the only thing the country exports. Now, of course, they get help from Russia because Russia has a big port that they use in Syria. Russia provides arms to the country. They're in Russia's back pocket. When the United Nations votes came to condemn Russia for the invasion of the Ukraine, so Nicaragua and Russia and Belarus and Syria and who else? Maybe Eritrea. They all voted to support Russia. A couple.
Clarify one thing.
Yeah.
Without the support of Russia and Iran, would not Assad, the other, have ended up just like Muammar Gaddafi?
Okay, good question. If not for the help of Russia and Iran, would Sadat be under? And I think yes. I think the answer is yes. That Russia certainly armed the country and watched over the borders of the country, and Iran infiltrated the country and supplied all kinds of weapons and soldiers, not just weapons, but soldiers, to the Syrian army, which was fighting against the rebels. Now, the rebels were also backed by outside forces. The rebels were backed by Turkey, somewhat by the West, to some degree or other. So it was a kind of as many civil wars end up, having an international component to it. You might recall that the Turks shot down a Russian plane in the middle of this civil war, and that could have led to all kinds of things. Israel stayed neutral in the civil war, although in a backdoor way, Israel became involved in the Syrian civil war, in that the Druze population of Syria is the largest Druze population in the world, and they are living in southern Syria. And of all areas of the whole country, that was the only area that was not touched by the civil war, because the Druze people said right away to the government, don't involve us. We won't be involved. We'll be neutral like we always are, but just, leave us out of it as best we could. But there were battles that came close and came inside, and the Druze population of Israel went to Mr. Netanyahu, when he was in power beforehand, and said, look, our compatriots might be threatened by the civil war, and we, the Druze community, want the Israeli military to help the Druzes in Syria, or else. That was the kind of promise that was made to the Israeli government. the Israeli government kind of had to make a decision what to do in this case, because the last thing they would want to do is get involved in the Syrian civil war, because then all sides would stop fighting each other and then fight Israel. So I think what happened was, and I'm the last person to know, but I'm guessing that what the Israeli government said is that on this, we will not get involved in the civil war whatsoever. That's what they said. What they also said was, not for publication, is that if the Druses ever get in trouble in Syria, we'll send them all kinds of weapons. Somehow we'll sneak them in. And what the Druze of Israel asked, and I'm saying asked, they asked the Israeli government, can we Druze soldiers go and serve in Syria as Israeli soldiers to help out the Druze population? And Israel said, no, that you can't do that, But, again, they probably said, well, but if you go as civilians and you sneak yourselves over the border, who are we to know? But luckily for everybody, for both sides, to this very day, the Druze are out of the Syrian civil war, and things are only now beginning to shake up in that community because of the poor economic situation of Syria as a whole. And they're also looking for a way out, those people. But in any case, so the reasons for allowing a dictatorship to come back into the good graces depend on the individual situation. But you could see how the world could say, look, to the Afghan leaders, the Taliban leaders, look, we want to help out the people there. They're starving, just let us operate and don't bother us, and let us do whatever we want. And we won't challenge your leadership of the country. So that's one way of doing it. Or to say, for example, we still want to boycott and put freezes on the assets of all the 100 richest people in Russia. But we don't have anything against the Russian people themselves. And to sort of try to go kind of around the leadership, to bypass the leadership, to get to the people. And then if it works, then the people themselves can make their own conclusions and say, look, the West isn't so bad because they're helping us. Maybe it's our leadership that has to be changed. But in many, many, many countries, whether it's Nicaragua, I didn't mention that country, or all the other ones that I mentioned, boycotts have just not been effective. And, sir, you pointed out the one place where it was effective, South Africa, which, is an exception because it was ruled by such a small percentage of the people with apartheid, and 90% of the people were disenfranchised. So clearly it was a special case. But all the other cases that I mentioned, when Trump pulled out of the Iran agreement to limit their nuclear potential, he thought he was punishing Iran because what he said was, well, if I pull out, then all of the sanctions against Iran will stay in place, and I'm just showing them how tough I am. But Iran said, okay, if you're pulling out and the sanctions are still in place, well, what incentive do we have to behave ourselves? We might as well just do bad things, and no one's going to stop us because they've already done everything they could. And now with the Russian-Ukrainian civil war, of course, Iran now has a new friend in Russia. Iran has sent all those drones to Russia. Russia and Iran are marketing their oil together. Both boycotted oils to China and to India and to the rest of Pakistan and any other countries that want to buy cheap oil. So, there's a limit to how much diplomatic actions can do. And since countries nowadays just don't want to send their armies in every time something happens, people have to learn to live with this situation and not have unrealistic expectations. That's kind of the way to do it, and to kind of try to find the middle point between, patting them on the back and saying you did such a good job the way they did to Assad, and maintaining a solid, complete boycott on the other hand, to try to find the middle way to deal with the people in a way, but not with the leadership. So, it's clearly the United States, after 10 years, should have said to Cuba, okay, hell with it. We're going to recognize your government. Why don't you hold an election now and then? Why don't you allow Americans to establish, I don't know what universities in Cuba, who knows what, like to do something to mitigate the hard communist regime that was there, but they didn't. And so, the regime is still there 63 years later. That's it. And the same thing with the Arab-Israeli boycott. I mean, what did they think, that Israel would come to its knees and Israel would just say, okay, we give up? It's been 75 years. Only now are Arab states beginning to say, well, you know what? They're not going away. So how is it going to benefit us? And, from there you had the accords with the UAE and with Bahrain and other countries like that. Although it was always said in Israeli politics that the second country to recognize Israel would be Lebanon, because Lebanon was a small, sort of independent but weak country, and they couldn't do anything on their own. But the moment one bigger Arab country would recognize Israel, Lebanon would jump in. And they would have, if it wasn't for the Hezbollah in Lebanese politics. So, the contrast of the two countries is amazing. Lebanon is a basket case, and Israel is a thriving, powerful country in the Middle East. So that's that. Let me see. Any questions or comments? Let me just check my watch. Yeah. Go ahead.
I think it was easy to boycott South Africa because South Africa doesn't produce anything that anybody particularly needs. So that was easy. You can't boycott Israel because people desperately need stuff that Israel produces. And a classic example of that was one of the BDS websites that they set up. And at the bottom was a little logo. This website was produced with the aid of this company.
Some company.
That was an Israeli.
An Israeli company, yeah. Well, like everybody says, anytime you use your cell phone, anytime you use some of the most basic tools of modern technology, like Waze, Mobileye, a lot of the medical devices and a lot of the medical research has been done in Israel, and it gets very hard in this day and age to boycott things because everything is so mixed. Like, say you want to boycott a Japanese car, right? Let's say. But I mean, Honda has factories in Ontario. Now, the materials that are in that car come from Korea, come from Thailand, come from Canada, come from Mexico, come from Japan, come from everywhere. So what are you boycotting? That's the way things are today. You're right. In South Africa, they produce wine, you could boycott wine. They produced fruits, you could boycott fruits. Things get much more, and South Africa held out for a very long time under the boycott. They didn't just collapse just like that. In fact, South Africa was the first. South Africa has no oil, or no oil or gas. So but they have plenty of coal. And what they figured out was, they were the first people who figured out how to make oil from coal, called coal gasification. And they were the ones who invented a process to do that, because, necessity is the mother of invention. And, but, they had really no friends. It's not like they could play off the Soviet Union against the West. There was nobody that was supporting South Africa. And the white leadership were actually in the hands of a very pragmatic person. And they could have been not. They could have been a not pragmatic person. It could have been somebody who said, the hell with it. We're going down like they tried in Rhodesia. But you know, Mr. de Klerk said, you know what, I see another vision of South Africa. And who's to say from the white's point of view, I don't want to sound crazy here, but from the white people's point of view, the changeover happened in 1994. I would say a large portion of the white people of South Africa have left the country already because of perceived and real discrimination against them, because of a deteriorating economy. The country is basically falling apart with crime, with electricity blackouts, with the corruption. It's not a good country. It really is not doing well at all. It has the highest unemployment rate in the world of any medium-sized or large countries. Their official unemployment rate is 32%. So, you know, my wife loves to watch this program, House Hunters International. I don't know, any of you have watched that program sometimes? It's about people who like to buy houses in foreign countries. Inevitably, they're white South Africans buying a house in France, buying a house in Portugal, buying a house in Spain, I don't know what, you know? So there is an exodus. There is an exodus of white South Africans, and there's not much immigration into South Africa, except from poorer black countries where their lives are even worse off than the blacks' lives are in South Africa. And there hasn't been a regime change in South Africa since the first election of 1994. So whenever a government this is a hint to anybody, if a government is in power for 29 years, you can be pretty sure that this government is not going to be a tip-top, efficient, honest, corruption-free government. It's impossible for it to happen. You need change, any change, just to be able to have a government kept on its toes. So, you know, so that's that. Anybody else? Any other comment? It was a good comment, that one. Any other questions? I know that we have, geez, I mean, so funny, I come out with pages of notes like this year. I got four fully written out pages. I didn't talk about the debt ceiling and the debt crisis. Let's see if there's anything I wanted to say. Just sometimes I write something down and I say, oh, you know what? No, pretty good. Yeah. Oh yes, Myanmar is another one. Myanmar, Belarus, Zimbabwe, Eritrea. These are all extra countries that are being boycotted. I didn't mention them. None of them are stars in the world, I have to say. And that, oh yes, there's just one last important point, is that if you make life miserable enough in a country by boycotting them, well, that also creates refugees. You know, if these countries can get out, if the people, I should say, can escape these countries, and they do, like Iran, like Cuba, you're creating more refugees, which means more problems for the world to deal with than if you were able to you know, have good economic relations and build up the economies in those countries. So when you think you're punishing a country by making life miserable in that country, what you're doing is creating refugees that are going to come and make life miserable in your country. So you know, that's an exaggeration, but you get the drift of the idea anyway. So let me see. Oh yeah, okay. So yeah, that's it. Thank you so much. Yeah, you have a question? Go ahead. Sure. 100th, yeah, May 27th. Wasn't even a week ago. It was Henry Kissinger is 100 years old, which is remarkable. he sat down for an 8-hour meeting with The Economist, one of my favorite magazines, by the way. His mind apparently is 100% working, as well as it always did. He was 13 years old when his family left Germany. His Jewish family left Germany in 1938. Imagine, 38. Like, what were they waiting for? And so he was 15 years old, meaning he was born in 1923. He still has that heavy German accent that he never got rid of, right? He obviously had a very distinguished career being a foreign affairs advisor to many Republican presidents, Bush and Nixon and Reagan, and especially Reagan. Reagan was kind of his star because they saw in him a kind of intellectual person without any very strong, first of all, without any political ambitions. That's one thing. And somebody who had principles. And Kissinger's principle was really to avoid a world war. Because he said, we lived through the Second World War. It was so horrible that we never want to even risk something like that again. And he worked very hard to try to create openings for the United States to recognize China, to get along with the Soviet Union, in order to prevent a nuclear war or any other kind of war. That was really, I would say, his legacy to the country. Yeah, it's basically, I would say, that's it. Now, like many, sometimes you would say to yourself, doesn't it seem normal that a refugee or somebody who comes into the country being poor would support the Democratic Party in the United States, or a party of the left, because it's usually the wealthy, nationalistic, conservative people who support the right-wing parties. And yet we have seen in the last U.S. election, last 2 U.S. elections, Henry Kissinger, there's a whole stream of newcomers that come to the United States and even to Canada to say, you know what, we appreciate the freedoms and democracy in this country so much that we don't want things to slide into some sort of socialistic type regime, which might end up, being taken over by friendly people to our enemies. And we appreciate the idea of free enterprise enough so that all we want to do is have a chance to work and make a living and not be taxed and not be regulated and not be environmentalized, and just let us do our thing and let the government mind its own business. And so there's a lot of immigrants who have that sort of feeling as well. And these are people who would vote for the Conservative Party or the Republican Party in the US. And there's a lot of people like that. So, it was once taken for granted almost by the Liberal Party in Canada that, all the immigrants are our people. But a lot of them are not. And, that's just, and in the US, the Hispanic population, which is now 44 million people in the US, so that's well over 10%, the people, getting close to 20%, see their roots in people who came from Latin America. Lots of these people, they're now splitting somewhere like 60 to 40% Democratic to Republican. So that's quite a lot. That's almost being even, in other words. And those are the reasons why, were the ones I just mentioned. So anybody else? Does Angela, anybody on Zoom who has a question?
No.
No. Okay, so thank you so much, everybody. I'll see you all next week. And we'll see what the world brings us. I haven't forgotten about, and I'm saving up any discussions about Israel, because I could sit and talk here for like 8 hours nonstop about what's happening in that country. But I'm just waiting. So thanks again.
What are you waiting for?
Good question.
The Messiah.
What are you waiting